Today, our webinar is around rethinking volunteer recruitment, basics and beyond. And I'm super excited. We're joined by Beth Steinhorn today. She's a second-time webinar presenter for us, our first ever second-time webinar presenter, backed by popular request, if you will. But before I introduce her, my name is Gung. It's like Gung Ho, if that's easier to remember. I am the co-founder and CEO here at Civic Champs. I live in Indianapolis. That's where we're based. We also have an office out of Pittsburgh. You can see a little bit about me on the right. I've had a sort of a varied career. A lot of that has been in tech, but I will say that the nonprofit sector is by far my favorite. You all are just incredibly fun to work with. And so every day I get to do this is sort of a blessing. And so with that, let me introduce you to Beth, our speaker for the day. Some of you might remember her from our webinar, I think, about a month or a month and a half ago. But Beth is I think I could say, sort of world-renowned expert on volunteer management and volunteer engagement. She is the president of VQ Volunteer Strategies, a consulting firm that helps nonprofits better engage, figure out their strategy for volunteer engagement and management. You could see some of her history or in career on her right. She spent a lot more time than I have in the nonprofit sector, certainly, and she's one of the leaders when it comes to the National Alliance for Volunteer Engagement. So super excited to have Beth. And with that, I'll let Beth take it away.
Thanks, Gung, and thanks to everyone for joining today. I'm happy to be tuning in virtually from my office in Denver, Colorado. Great to see all of you on this call today to explore this topic of volunteer recruitment. Before I give you the overview and our itinerary for the day, I want to start with a story because recruitment is a challenge for so many organizations currently. And yet a couple months ago, when a participant in a recent webinar of mine messaged in the chat that she actually was having success in recruitment, and I noticed that she was representing a CASA, court-appointed special advocates, I was very intrigued and very impressed. And fortunately, she was willing to speak to me. So I want to share some of the strategies that I learned that Tara Dempster of CASA Orange County shared with me. One of the reasons that I was so intrigued was that recruiting volunteers to be a court-appointed special advocate is in and of itself a really challenging endeavor because there are many key aspects of being a CASA volunteer that pose some additional challenges beyond some of the things we've been seeing in the chat today. Not that your job is easy, but some of these distinguish recruiting a CASA from some more flexible opportunities like food pantry. It may be more like Isabel's thing around mentoring. Because, for example, the commitment for being an advocate is a really intense one, both in terms of hours for training initially and a long-term commitment to see a child through whatever case is being reviewed and for which you're advocating for them. There's also a high volume need due to a huge need for advocates. Many CASAs, Orange County included, need to recruit a high volume in order to even chip away at the waiting list so many organizations are facing. For CASA OC, the year that Tara joined, they had only sworn in 128 new volunteers, which was way under target for them. And in this fiscal year alone, they sought to recruit 155 high-quality volunteers that reflect the diversity of the children that they serve in Orange County. Each of those individuals is required to complete 34 hours of training, followed by 10 to 15 hours per month commitment. So it's a big challenge. Tara also mentioned that because of their policies, and I won't go into all the detail here, there was built in a fairly significant lag time between somebody inquiring to be a volunteer and actually attending an info session. So those were, that again was a pretty lot of challenges stacking up on this balancing image here. And yet they overcame that by instituting a couple really key strategies. First, Tara, who was new to this role as a volunteer engagement professional, she really took the opportunity to network. She joined in 2021 after having been an advocate but it was her first formal role. So she's been taking trainings like you are joining this today, talking to other CASA staff across the country, and meeting with local folks in her own community as well to learn and share resources. She also looked at policies and adjusted protocols. For example, to become a CASA in California, one must complete 34 hours of training. The interview didn't happen until after training. And through her internal advocacy, they shifted that to before the training. Now they have a trimmed down application and an interview, and then the candidate goes through the training. And it made a huge difference. Their retention is stronger because they're able to start building that relationship with the individual from day one. They, of course, make sure that they say that you're not going to be placed until you've successfully completed training. They're able to begin collaborating much earlier on with the volunteer. They also invested in some new processes to create community, recognizing that the experience of being a male CASA is very different than the majority who are female CASAs. CASA OC piloted affinity groups for male advocates, providing support and investing in events where they encourage male CASAs to bring a friend, which has really helped with recruitment. And along those lines, they've invested in personas, or they've leveraged the concept of personas, an approach to targeted recruitment, which I'll come back to. So stay tuned more later in this session. So because of all these things, CASA OC has really been beating the odds. And I want to share more about their approaches later on, but I'll also share how you can adapt their practices for your organization. So our hope today is that by the time you leave our hour together, or 50 minutes together, you'll be able to summarize some recent research regarding volunteer recruitment in the US, be able to identify barriers that might be posing challenges in your own organization for prospective volunteers so that you can then begin to mitigate those, develop a refined position descriptions that'll help you enhance engagement, and leverage this concept of personas to increase your recruitment success. We'll do that by first having me walk through some highlights of trends and research. Then I'll share a number of these strategies for you to take, and we'll have some handouts at the end that you'll be able to access so you can apply these strategies in your own organization. And of course, we'll have time for discussion. That said, I want to underscore what Gung mentioned. Please feel free to use the chat as much as you want to add your questions, even commenting on other participants, because we want this to be a hearty participatory event. So let's dive in. Let's start with a little bit of research. Earlier this year in 2023, a landmark study was released called The State of Volunteer Engagement, Insights from Nonprofit Leaders and Funders. It was the first study of its kind that included interviews with both volunteer, nonprofit and entity leaders, CEOs, as well as funders, to really look at what's the state of volunteer engagement and of funding for volunteer engagement in the US, especially post-pandemic. Or since pandemic. This research was conducted in 2022. And what we learned, which hopefully will make you feel not so alone, is that 64% of nonprofits reported an increase in demand for their services and that staff workload has grown. And yet 29% are operating with less funding and paid staff than before the pandemic, and 42% are operating at about the same level of financial support. So what does all that mean? It means that demand for services went up while staff and resources stayed level, or in fact went down. And that poses some pretty big challenges. Pair that with additional challenge, because of course I look at that as a volunteer engagement advocate and leader and say, well, the answer is engage volunteers to help address that increased demand for services and build capacity beyond what staff alone can achieve. And yet, it's not so simple, because we also see that between 2019 and 2022, the percent of nonprofit leaders reporting difficulty in finding volunteers with the skills they need or during the times that they need it has nearly doubled. 21% in 2019 said we have trouble finding volunteers during the workday. 40% reported that in 2022. Similarly, 18% struggle to find volunteers with needed skills, and 35+% struggle to find it in 2022. And so we know that that's a challenge. This was underscored not just by CEOs, but also by your peers, if you're, or maybe your CEOs, maybe some of you are volunteer coordinators, but this was also enforced by the 2023 VolPro Volunteer Management Report that Toby Johnson puts together every year. In January of this year, it was published that nearly 1 out of 3 of all volunteer coordinators around the globe who responded to her survey noted recruitment as a top challenge in their open-ended response to the question, what's your number one biggest volunteer management challenge right now? The highest share of challenges noted since 2019. So recruitment is a challenge. And we also see that nearly 70% of nonprofits are engaging fewer volunteers than normal, however they define normal, in 2022. Not a huge surprise because, of course, the volunteer rate across the US dropped dramatically between 2017 and 2021. Yes, there was a pretty big boost between 2015 and 2017 from almost 25% of adults volunteering to over 30%. But of course, due to pandemic restrictions, concerns, changes in capacity, all sorts of things, it dropped significantly down to 23.2% in 2021, the lowest it had been in more than 15 years. I hope I'm not overwhelming with too much data. Urvi asks, do we know what drove the spike in 2017? I'll tell you what I believe are factors that drove that spike, but this is not published data point. It's my interpretation. Between 2015 and 2017, I think a couple things happened. In particular, in 2016, there was a great mobilization of people on all sides of the political spectrum, really becoming very active around issues that were important to them during an election year that was rather contentious. And so I think there was a tremendous amount of activism that spiked an interest and an actual actual volunteering for issues that are important to them. I think that was a big piece. And there may have also been a slight, even though they say that there wasn't the case, there may have been a slight broadening of the definition in the questions around what volunteering really means. But I think a lot of it had to do with activities in 2016 that inspired people to really act. And then, of course, what drove the drop? It was a lot of stay-at-home orders and concerns about health, et cetera. So the last bit of data I want to share just to paint this picture and help you see what might be behind some of the experiences you may be, you and your colleagues at your own organization or in your own community may be experiencing. We also see on the staff side, the Great Resignation. The Great Resignation lasted for more than a year, and the number of quits by American workers in 2022 and back into 2021 topped 4 million per month. That is a huge amount of resignations. And I think that affects our work and volunteer engagement in a couple different ways. One, people have a mentality of really rethinking and reevaluating how they spend their time, whether for paid work and possibly for unpaid work in volunteering. So you may be experiencing shifts because people are reevaluating, is this really how I want to be sharing and donating my time? Maybe I want to use different skills or gain other skills, or I moved because I can work remotely now and live in a different place. And so it's not as accessible. That's one way. Another way that I'm seeing this very deeply affect our field is that there's tremendous turnover in our nonprofits. You may be new in the last couple of years, and if you aren't new, you are likely working with colleagues who are very new to volunteer engagement, and they may not be as ready or open to recruiting volunteers and engaging them in their work, which means it's on your shoulders or your opportunity to really begin to advocate for this among your peers. So what are the ways that we can address and overcome some of these challenges? Again, if you're here because you're challenged with recruiting, you're not alone. This data and the other, 4 dozen people on this call attest to the fact that you're not alone. But how can we overcome it? It's nice to know that you're not alone, but what are the ways that you can begin to chip away at this? And I do have a couple suggestions. And surprisingly, perhaps, it doesn't start with simply developing a volunteer recruitment plan. There is no quick fix to this complexity of issues. So I want to start with a couple other elements to consider before developing a recruitment plan. And conveniently, they all begin with P. First, we're going to talk about policy and perspective. Then we're going to move on to positions, practice. Then we'll begin to move into more specific strategies like personas, and finally, planning. So let's dive in with this list of P's, and we're going to start with policies and perspectives. Rob Jackson, who is I'm honored to say, a friend and colleague, he's a leader in volunteer engagement over in the UK. He wrote a wonderful blog not that long ago where he really encapsulated the disconnect between what a lot of nonprofits were doing and what volunteers really want and need. Because the temptation when we have recruitment challenges is to just do what we've been doing, but do it more loudly or more widely, right? But the problem is the approaches to recruitment that may have worked in 2015, 16, 17, 18, 19 will not work in a context where attitudes towards volunteering have shifted in some of the ways that I've already shared. People want to volunteer on their terms and perhaps do things that may well not match your organization's traditional understanding of volunteering. And all of this change means that, as Rob says, doing what we've always done won't get what we've always got. And as he notes here, the world has changed and so must we. Trying harder to recruit and retain volunteers just isn't going to cut it. Because if the roles we want volunteers to do aren't flexible and impactful enough, then however well-crafted and fancy-looking our recruitment campaign is, we're still going to struggle to engage new volunteers. Because in a cost of living crisis, if we don't make available the funds to reimburse volunteer expenses, then people won't volunteer because they simply can't afford to be out of pocket to subsidize our work. Because if we're not prepared to set up flexible opportunities to let volunteers to take a break, to switch roles, to walk away, then our retention efforts will stall and likely fail. And for our organizations to succeed at volunteer engagement post-lockdown, we need systemic change. Volunteer engagement requires proper resourcing, proper support, and needs to be elevated to a strategic priority. That's not just something that senior leaders talk nicely about and neglect for the rest of the year. We need to really look at the systems of engagement, because we keep volunteers by being open to letting them go, not hanging on to them for dear life. And that is a pretty big shift in perspective. Are we willing to let volunteers go during the summer when they have to take care of children or grandchildren and come back? Are we willing to let them go, but then engage virtually when they live in a different county or state? And to his point as well, what are the barriers that are impeding prospective volunteers from engaging with us? What are the transportation costs, perhaps, that keep volunteers from serving with us? Do they have limited access to technology? Are there inaccessible requirements, inflexible requirements? Are there other things that perhaps keep volunteers from engaging with you? Parking costs, etc. Weigh in the chat if you have identified some barriers that impede or pose challenges for volunteers to start up with your organization, or perhaps continue with your organization. For CASA OC in Orange County, they really were looking at funding sources to help with reimbursements for gas cards. When I interviewed Tara, gas prices were at an all-time high in California, and yet being an advocate means having to drive or get to the children whom you're serving, your matches. So what are some of the barriers that you might be experiencing in your organization? Hopefully some of you will weigh in the chat. Minimum age for safety in the warehouse, Megan says, has made it challenging, not just for young people, but for young families. That's a great point. And of course, I would never advocate for giving up safety protocols, but I would say, is there another way that young families or families with young children could serve, perhaps not in the warehouse, but in a side room to do some sorting? Or I remember when my kids were little, we sometimes were able to I don't know what the proper word is, but basically scoop out and divide up rice into smaller servings. And that was something that could be done at home or in a side room. So what are the ways you might be able to overcome that challenge without jeopardizing anyone's safety? I hope you'll also see that, is particularly around retention, but I think it relates to recruitment as well, we need to be rethinking what success is. And for recruitment, it's often been identified that success really is just number of volunteers filling slots. But how do you look at intermediate metrics like number of inquiries, number of applications, to really understand your pipeline so that you can make informed decisions about the strategies that you continue or perhaps retire in terms of recruitment? For CASA OC, they used to celebrate really only those who stayed for many, many years. But increasingly, they have volunteers who are in school or looking to return to school. And for the cases that they're assigned to, they're model advocates. Showing up, they file reports, but they generally only stay for the minimum 2-year commitment. And that means their pipeline has to be even stronger. And so Tara had to encourage her peers to look at these kind of one-off resume building volunteers as a positive rather than a negative. But they also needed to look at the policy and say any one staff member would only have a limited number of these short-termer volunteers so that they didn't have to keep training up newbies along the way. So especially with this idea of recruitment success, I'd love to turn it over to Gang for a moment to talk about how technology can help us look at those metrics and inform our strategies. Gang?
Yeah, no, this is super fascinating. I left a couple of comments in chat as you're going. I think my reflection is a lot of us feel certain things, but don't always have the data to back it up. And so it's always great to see that the stats back up our, what we're feeling day to day. And I thought that the tips were awesome too. And so as, we were talking about barriers, right? And so I think one of the things that came up with like technology barriers, and that's obviously what Civic Champs does, is addressing those barriers. And so for those of you that maybe first time hearing, joining our webinar, Civic Champs is a volunteer management software company. So we help nonprofits like yourself with, onboarding, recruiting, tracking hours, waivers, getting people scheduled, getting reports done, right? So that full platform. But what I really wanted to highlight is just a couple of things. So as Beth talked about, from a recruitment standpoint, some of the things that help a lot is just making the process easier for folks. And so, for example, this is what you're seeing is the mobile app for Civic Champs. And this is just an example of how technology could support you, right? So there's certainly other vendors out there, not just us. But one of the things you can do on the mobile app is you can actually sign up for events, right, on Civic Champs. And so this is one way that we try to make it easier for folks and streamline things. And this is just a sample event that I've created today. It's a food pantry who's looking for, volunteers for daily hot lunches. And so if the date and location, that looks all good, a volunteer could hit register. Right? They could select the shift that they're interested, what role they might want to do. And then at that point, right, they're registered. And a few things I think technology could help with. One is you can, for example, we send out a calendar invite automated reminders, right? So getting people, and I think the automated reminders is less about getting them to your site on time and that to make sure that they arrive. That's certainly part of it. But the other part is volunteers like having clear instructions, right? And understanding what it is that they need to do. How is it that they're, you want your expectations for them. And so those automated reminders can also serve to help with that, right? So depending on, the information you have on there. The other thing right here is, you can see the contact person for this role. And so that allows volunteers potentially reach out if they have questions. And then on the admin side, right, we provide not reminders, but notifications to the point of contact, right? If someone registers or unregisters, again, trying to make that process a little easier so that in many ways, it's impossible for us as a technology vendor to replace the face-to-face interactions and the true engagement that you can have with somebody. And so our goal really is to remove all the other ancillary work that you might have to do so that you can spend more time with your volunteers, right? And so I'm going to shift over real quick just so you can see potentially what this might look like on the web. And so on Civic Champs, you can engage, on mobile, on web, or a kiosk. And so, for here you could see again, this is an example of a web calendar that we have. Again, making recruitment maybe a little bit easier, right, by having the ability for people to sign up online, selecting, what they want to do for the day. And then one of the things that we also do is, for example, waivers, right? This is, potentially painstaking, takes a lot of time. This is an example, it's pretty short, but you could see an example of a waiver. They could, they can agree to it right here. And we track things like the expiration date so that it automatically prompts people, right? Emergency contact, also very important. Hopefully you never have to use it, right? But on the off chance that you do, right, you certainly want to have that information available. Also, I just realized that is actually my wife's phone number. I don't know if that's something she would like me sharing. But that's okay. I trust you all. So, but anyway, again, I think this is just an example of maybe what technology could do for folks if you haven't used software like Civic Champs in the past. But with that, let me turn it back over to Beth. And then she's going to tell you a little about on positions and crafting what good positions might look like and how you might want to think about it.
Thanks, Gang. So we talked about policies and perspective. Let's move on to positions. You can't revitalize recruitment and make it work if what you are recruiting volunteers to do is not appealing to them. And you can't get your colleagues, staff members, to want to engage volunteers if the work that volunteers are going to be doing isn't actually capacity building, meaningful work that's aligned with your mission. And I've shared many times in lots of different webinars and coaching and all sorts of things, my little Venn diagram for understanding what that depicts what a strategic volunteer role is. It's about finding the overlap between what volunteers today, prospective volunteers, are interested in doing and what your organization truly needs. Where that overlap exists is the sweet spot for strategic engagement. And so if you're having trouble recruiting for a particular volunteer role, one of the first things I would encourage you to do is actually look at that volunteer role and determine, is it truly in this sweet spot? Does the scheduling options align with what volunteers are seeking? And is the work truly meaningful? Because if it's not, volunteers have a name for that. They can smell it, they define it. It's called busy work, and they're not going to come back and do it again. So we have to remember that as many volunteers or prospective volunteers have revised what they want, that target of overlap has really shifted. One of the ways to make sure that volunteer positions are in fact strategic is by really writing a comprehensive and thorough position description. Doing so ensures that you assess whether the role is in fact strategic and appealing. It gives you what you need to cultivate qualified candidates to basically recruit, Once someone is on board, it becomes the basis for accountability and support. And then it even gives you information on what you need for meaningful recognition of volunteers. I'm not going to go through this in tremendous detail, but in my view, writing a comprehensive position description should include each of these elements. A title, and volunteer isn't a title, that's just an indication of the pay grade, let's say, but people are inspired by titles that are meaningful to them and are attractive to them. What are the key responsibilities? Not the 27 item long laundry list of everything that they do, but rather, what are the 3, 4, 5 things for which they're responsible? Impact and outcome. What's the difference that they're going to make for themselves, for the people being served, for the organization, for the community? That's vital. If you can't answer that question, then this isn't a strategic role for a volunteer to play. What training and support will you provide? What commitment are you expecting? What qualifications are you seeking? If you don't ask for someone who's tech savvy or has experience in public speaking or has a valid driver's license, then you're not necessarily going to get those qualifications. And finally, what's in it for the volunteer? What benefits will they get? It might be something like discounts on theater tickets if you're a cultural arts organization, or it might simply be the chance to help youth close the literacy gap. It might be the chance to work on a great team of people. That's still a benefit. Many organizations in recent years, especially in light of this recruitment crisis, have been rethinking positions. I started my career in museums, and I'm thrilled to be able to work with a number of museums across the country, along with many other types of organizations. And I think that it's been really inspiring to see how many museums are rethinking and restructuring positions so that they're willing to let go, as an indication of their willingness to let go of the way things have always been done, right? So thinking about what visitors want, more often visitors to museums want short interactions rather than lengthy tours. And this takes a different type of volunteer rather than a tour guide, a docent that knows all the answers. It's someone who is really more there to facilitate, and that affects training. If we want volunteering to be accessible, then we need to look at training requirements as well. There have for years been many museums, particularly art museums, that required literally years of training in order to be a vetted docent. But if what they're doing is facilitating learning instead, that can be done a little more quickly, and more of the learning can be done on the job. Going back to our friend Tara Webster from CASA Orange County, as I mentioned, being a CASA advocate requires at least 30 hours of training. And yet, for museums, there's no national regulation requiring museums docents to take 30 hours of training, yet many museums still do that. So what can you do to really look at making your roles more accessible more widely? To that end, we talked about policy and position. I talked about or policy and perspective, and then position. As I talk about training, we move into practice. In a recently published booklet, New Voices and Perspectives in Volunteer Engagement by Aaron Spink, Brandy Sean Chaparro wrote regarding training and other practices, consider what's necessary for volunteers to know for their role and whether you can hybridize their training. Again, as many of us did with the onslaught of the outbreak of the pandemic, we moved a lot of things to virtual. But I'm hearing across the country, many people want to go back to in-person, and yet there's a disconnect between what people say they want and what they're really willing to go do. And while many volunteers may be saying, I want things in person, I have many clients who are saying, and yet they're not showing up when we do things in person. So how can we continue to not just go back to the way things were in 2019, but really continue to offer hybrid options to make things more accessible and more appealing? To that end, I'd really like to launch a poll, which you should see now popping up on your screen. If not, check your dashboard and click on poll, but it should be on your screen. And you are being invited to answer, which practices have you adapted to make volunteering more accessible and attractive? And you can select as many as are relevant to you. Have you adapted training requirements? Have you adapted perhaps minimum service requirements? The location of volunteering? Do you offer reimbursements or cost savings? And I see a number of others being listed. Please use the chat to share a little more about what other things you've done to or are doing and adapting to address or reduce some of these challenges, or to make volunteering more accessible and attractive. So I'm going to give you all just a couple more seconds. We have about half of you having responded to the poll. I'm hoping we can get a few more during my little online tap dance here. Felicia says, flexible scheduling. Self-scheduling is a big piece, and technology can enable us to do that a lot more easily. Volunteers really like to, someone else, Omar, weighed in with more flexible scheduling. That is a really positive shift, and it's a great way to leverage technology and to fit into volunteers' real need to and desire to be able to self-schedule, and giving our colleagues access to the schedules can help them feel comfortable that they know who's coming on each shift, as opposed to always relying on the way things were, like, oh, it's Tuesday, so we're going to have Jane come. This allows them to be able to really understand and prepare for the volunteers who are coming. So I'm going to close the poll. Let's see. Maria says fun flyers. Felicia says cross training, streamlined and simplified application process. Love it. So keep those answers coming. And I'm going to close the poll and share the results. And you can see that we have quite a diversity. Interestingly, half of you, more than half, have shifted something about the location of volunteering. I'm really intrigued with that. More than 1 in 10 said reimbursements or cost savings. Almost half have looked at training requirements. So lots of shifts, and I would say keep those coming as you keep experimenting with those as you move forward. So we've talked about, again, policy and perspective, positions. We now talked a little bit about practice. Now let's talk, none of which actually had to do with recruitment per se, but now let's really dive into that concept that I introduced from Casa Orange County, which is personas. Personas are simply groups of like-minded individuals, and they are a strategy that can be leveraged for recruitment of volunteers. They're distinct pools of prospective volunteers that you can target through recruitment. In 2022, McKinsey & Company published a really fascinating article about recruitment of paid employees. With the Great Resignation and a real low unemployment, companies were really challenged to attract and retain employees in the same ways that they had been doing it. And new research identified by McKinsey 5 types of workers that employers could reach out to fill jobs. I read this article and immediately thought, this is the same thing that we're seeing in volunteer engagement. And it's a shift that allows us to think differently about the mismatch between what our prospects are looking for and the way that we've been recruiting them. So I want to share a little bit about the personas that McKinsey's research identified. And again, this had to do with paid employees, but they surfaced 5 groups of people. Yes, as you hear them, you may think, oh, that's just generations remixed, but it isn't just. They're cross-generational. They cross-cut generations, but they still have some characteristics that we often associate with generations. So the first were traditionalists, career-oriented, but really individuals who care about work-life balance. They're motivated to work for high compensation when it comes to paid work and title, and they were the easiest group to find with normal recruitment tactics. But there were 4 other groups that were not necessarily responsive to traditional recruitment tactics. Groups like the do-it-yourselfers, who are motivated by autonomy. They tend to be 25 to 45 years old. They might be self-employed. They might be full-time employed, and to gig workers and part-time workers. So one way to attract them is to really offer discrete, meaningful tasks. That was the first time in the article where I thought, oh my gosh, this is exactly like volunteer engagement. Volunteers want short-term project-based roles, and our attempts to keep fitting a round peg into a square hole when volunteers really want to be serial volunteers, not ongoing volunteers, that's where it really began to resonate. A third category, a third persona were caregivers, people who are caring for the sandwich generation, caring for older parents as well as perhaps younger kids or grandchildren. Idealists, students or younger part-timers, and the relaxers where career doesn't come first anymore, but maybe are interested in the working world to still do some part-time work to share their expertise. So as I began exploring this with volunteer engagement, that's another reason why I was intrigued in talking with CASA OC. CASA OC really had been already leveraging this idea of personas. They looked at their existing personas, meaning they looked at their current volunteer corps and said, personas already exist. Whom are we already attracting as a CASA volunteer? And they identified 3 and they gave them each names. The empty nester, whom they had to name Beth, though it wasn't modeled after me, though it sounds familiar. A married mother whose children had recently flown the nest with a history of volunteerism through her faith organization and now has time to focus on their CASA role. They named Jean, the retired professional, a recently retired therapist or teacher or social worker or probation officer looking for ways to stay engaged with children. And the newer mom, Jenny, maybe has a part-time job, maybe stays home full-time with her children, but as her children are a little more self-sufficient, looking for ways to help other children. And for each, they considered likely age, gender, interests, and where they normally first encounter these individuals. But they didn't stop there because that's just trying to reach into the same pools they're already successfully reaching. They said, who are our aspirational personas? Who are our outliers that we want more of? Or whom do we think we could attract? And they developed these 3 personas. The professional go-getter, whom they named Ian, works long hours at his job, but makes the time to commit to his CASA role, likes to be engaged in initiatives to support more youth, and is keen on recruiting more male advocates. They have the resume builders, whom they named Caitlin. I already talked a little bit about them. They might be working with youth while also studying social work or law or child development, and has wants to build their resume by working with CASA. And then there's Lizbeth, the community conscious, who may have heard the call for Latinx Spanish speakers and wants to support youth from her community. So that's an example of how they were able to analyze their current data and then build on that to develop strategies to reach new audiences. And that, again, is something technology can help with. So I'm going to turn it over to Gus.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, persona, I'm so grateful. It was so interesting to have you cite McKinsey, some of my former colleagues, if you will. So I noted I'm definitely a do-it-yourselfer as well. And so if anyone's recruiting me as a volunteer, that's what will work. But what you're looking on screen here, right, is again Civic Champs. And so this is Emily Elizabeth, right? And you could see, this is her profile on our page. And what you have, right, is a couple things. On the left is all of her, contact information and all that, which is great. But on the right, you could start to, leave notes around your volunteer, right? These could be things around availability. Maybe it's things around dietary preferences, but you can also, to Beth's point, right, you could, think about what persona perhaps Emily is part of, right? And then you could see, what waivers she has, and then if there's reflections, right? So this is one of the things we track is whether, somebody has had a bad or a good experience, right? And you could see this and maybe some of the thoughts they had, and then what questionnaires they might have answered. And that's another place that perhaps from a persona standpoint, you can start to filter or understand what persona that somebody falls under, right? Is you ask some of the questions, you say, oh, Emily is a, also a do-it-yourselfer. And so we're going to engage her in a special way, right? And then across the board, if you look at this, what we call our activity log, right, you can see when people check in and check out. We also track all of that feedback that they're giving. A great way to also collect testimonials. But again, across the board, Beth talked about, hey, could we mine our existing database to identify who is really happy with us, right? And so seeing Emily Elizabeth, hey, she's a really great advocate. She's really happy. What are the attributes, right? What are the things that make her and maybe some of the other folks in our existing volunteer corps look similar, or they're motivated by similar things, right? And this is just a tool to maybe help you identify those folks. So yeah, with that, I'll turn it back over to Beth as she talks about planning and next steps.
Thanks. So in the last few minutes, I just want to share how we can take that whole these considerations, policy and perspective, positions, practices, I'm doing my own little test here, and personas, and incorporate them into a plan. And again, in terms of personas, you want to audit your current volunteers, think about who's already there, and what do we know about them, and think about what barriers may be impeding other like volunteers or new personas from engaging with us, and work to remove them. And then you want to really define what success is. Are you looking to increase numbers? Are you looking to increase your pipeline? There are a lot of different ways to measure success, and you can't do all of it. So are you looking to increase return volunteers or first-time volunteers, right? These are all things that you can be defining. And then you can identify your prospective personas and personalize your pitch. So one of the tools that you'll be able to access, and we'll tell you about that at the end, is a little tool that you can help define your goals and metrics for recruitment and also retention. And then we'll also share a tool around personas. And again, just to give you a guide around what are some of the steps to help develop personas. First, you want to identify your current ones. What do current volunteers have in common? What are successful recruitment strategies to reach those individuals? What are your aspirational personas? Maybe you already reached some and you'd like to increase, or who else are likely volunteers that would help you achieve your mission? And it's not everybody, right? That's not going to be successful. You need to really hone in and prioritize your resources. Then you can develop a targeted recruitment plan. And in that process, you want to be able to answer, where might we find these individuals? What would attract them? When's the right time to reach out? Who are the right people? Maybe it's not you. Maybe it's about who knows these people and can connect us to them. And then how will you ensure an inclusive experience once they're recruited? And with that, and you'll be able to answer some of these questions as you go through some of the handouts as well, a recruitment plan that will be available to you. And with that, what we really hope today is that we've helped you go a little beyond the basics, beyond that temptation to just do more of the same, because it may not work in this ever-changing environment. New circumstances demand new approaches, not just for recruitment, but for the experience that volunteers have when they begin to engage with you as well. So think about what are those policies, practices, and positions, and see if any of them are barriers, and see where you can adjust them. Maybe not everything, but figure out where you can start. Then you can leverage personas to pilot new recruitment tactics, and of course, track results, because that will help you determine which ones are worth repeating in the future. You can use this QR code, or I think Chloe's going to be adding a link in the chat for downloading tools to help you identify personas, to articulate your retention and recruitment goals, or your recruitment and retention goals, and also that targeted recruitment plan that you can use to help you really prioritize your recruitment efforts. And that's not all. Gung has something to share from Civic Champs as well.
Yeah, this is just our we try to do some sort of offer, and this is our latest one, which is, on the website, for annual contracts, we often offer, 1 month free. But if you've attended this webinar, our little thank you is, to provide 2 months free. And so, we're going to do this, promotion through September 21st. So if you just click and book a demo, just mention that you attended this webinar, and we'll be able to offer this discount for you. So. And then if you, terms of staying in touch with either myself or Beth, right? So you have both our emails. These actually do come to us, as Beth will attest. And then, of course, there's our websites if you want to take a look at either VQ Volunteer Strategies or Civic Champs, right? And so with that, yeah, we'd love to open this up for any additional questions from folks. I know we've answered a number of them throughout. So, but if there's any other questions for Beth, yeah, please put that in chat, or feel free to even raise your hand, and you can come off mute and actually say it in person if you'd like.
While folks are hopefully typing or finding the hand raise option, I'll just add my thanks to all of you for participating and for joining today, and for all the work that you do every day to help engage volunteers in your important missions. And I really appreciate it and wish you great success. Any questions?
I see a number of thank yous coming through. that's
very
awesome.
Welcome. Yeah.
And we're gonna provide a recording as well. So folks often ask about that, and so if you want to share this with other folks who might not have made it, you'll be able to do that through the recording, right? Yeah. And maybe Beth, one question I had as I was, you had the different steps, but if I'm a relatively new volunteer coordinator, which I think we have a lot of, and I'm getting started and I want to do all of this, what do you think is like the first thing you'd recommend I do, like the very, very first step?
Well, I think that if in terms of recruitment, I think first taking time to do a little bit of an audit would be helpful, right? What do I know about the volunteers who already serve? What do we know about the recruitment efforts that are being done? And do we know if they've been successful? I think that's, first you want to just get the state of the state, what's working, and who is currently among your cadre of volunteers. After that, I also think it's helpful to talk to other staff members who may be actually working with volunteers on a daily basis and see if they have any ideas about recruitment efforts. What are their needs? Are they looking for volunteers with specific skills? Do they know people with those skills? A lot of times we have new volunteer coordinators who, maybe they're taking over in a role where the other staff haven't felt that they are heard, or I can't tell you how many surveys we do where other staff say, I don't know with whom to share my ideas about volunteer engagement, or I don't know if my ideas will be taken seriously. So I think building internal relationships is really helpful. And I really like what Austin weighed in with as well. Talk to current volunteers about what's working for them. And you want to build on that too. So I think first is really just getting a sense of and building relationships with current volunteers and current staff, and then building a plan from there once you have some buy-in and relationships.
Awesome. Well, that's super, super helpful. It looks like we're probably a little short on the end of session questions, so we'll just wrap it up. But I just want to say a huge thank you and shout out for joining us yet again. Every session or every webinar has been super, super engaging, and I've learned a lot. And so really appreciate you, Beth, in joining us again.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.